What are you on about?
So you're on the list from servers for the vendor meeting next week. Are you going to go out there?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't. I got to observe this.
I think that's what I am too. Though I'm supposed to be more actively involved. I don't know how yet. So.
It'll be interesting.
So I'm going to miss your meeting. I got the announcement of the latest survey.
Oh yeah.
Well, survey. I've got to do something at the academy that day. I've got a copy of the room.
Yeah, if you want to do any writing or anything, we can brief you on it. It's some pretty interesting findings.
So good. I'm looking forward to seeing it. All right. See you Monday.
We're going to try to get going about 10 seconds or 20 seconds. Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Dave Rajewski. I direct the Science and Technology Innovation Program here, and joining me is Jay Pendergrass and Lisa Goldman from ELI. So we're going to take you through or try to simplify a rather excruciating quantitative analysis that we've been involved in probably for the past year or so. I'm just going to say a few words sort of to set the context and give you a sense of the genesis of the project. I started getting involved in this in 1991 when I was at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I was running a small group that did futures research. And one day we had the bright idea of trying to figure out what the energy system of the U.S. would look like in 20 years. And we started to look around to see if there was any sort of baseline map that we could use, and we couldn't really find anything good. And so we wandered over to a new office that they had set up called the Office of Pollution Prevention. You might remember there was a Pollution Prevention Act in 1990. And there was a number of people there that said that would be an interesting exercise. Let's just figure out where the energy is going. And one of the people that worked on the original map is here with us, Dave Bassett. And so we said, well, okay, let's just start this. We had no idea what we were getting into, and this took 5 or 6 months. But before we started, we just said, okay, we're going to set some principles in doing this because we knew it wasn't going to be an easy exercise. And I'll share these with you because they're the same principles that I think drove us for the last year as we went through the subsidy analysis and updated the energy flow analysis. We wanted to actually show the whole system. Our feeling was the political system kind of slices and dices pieces. They'll show you how much is going into ethanol. They'll show you how much is going to fossil fuels or low energy lighting or whatnot. And then quite often you get into this game of it's a zero-sum trade-off. And so we said, let's just see if we can graph out the entire system. We wanted to be really crystal clear about assumptions, where the system boundaries were, what was in, what was out, and what the sources of uncertainty were. We thought that was only fair. We wanted to just show relative proportions. Just order of magnitudes. Don't get lost in the weeds. This was not a decimal point exercise, and it never was. We focused on the numbers. We were sort of essentially taking the role of actuaries almost, not the politics, though there's certain kind of policy implications that can be, I think, withdrawn from a lot of what we'll show you today. And we decided we were going to draw this. In fact, the original files are sitting on that computer, which is in my Macintosh historical archive in my basement. I haven't been actually able to extract the file, so we had to take a picture of it. But we decided why not use the ability of this new kind of computer technology to draw the entire thing and use it as kind of a new way of communicating with policy folks. That's what came out after about 6 months of work. This is a fairly complex map. It wasn't designed to be sort of digested in 10 seconds. But I think the interesting thing was, if you go up here and look at sort of the emerging supply options, the size of those bars are what the potential was at that time. And those little tiny things, which we could barely draw, in the middle was what we were using. Okay? And you could see that we weren't doing too bad with biomass, and hydropower was not too bad. I think the really thing that got our attention, and any physicist or engineer who looked at this, was the thermodynamic inefficiency of the system. These large yellow arrows are waste heat. Or actually, that's not a good term, actually. Waste heat is just, it's unused heat. We should be calling it unused or unutilized heat. And what we actually used in terms of a society were these small arrows at the very bottom. This is lighting, heating, cooling, mobility, mechanical power to do things. So we built this incredibly large infrastructure to produce very small amounts of usable energy at the bottom. So that's kind of where we were in 1992. And so part of this exercise was, let's update that. If you look at kind of what's happened, this is the U.S. right here. We've added about 16 quads of energy since 1992. So every year, that's a quadrillion BTUs, 10 to the 15th BTUs. Unfortunately, what's on the bottom here kind of dropped off. That's China. This is Russia. This is Germany. This is France, I believe, all the way down to Belgium. Just to give you kind of relative scales. And that's the U.S. So essentially, I think it's kind of an undisciplined growth in terms of just energy use. Now, the amount of economic output per unit of energy going in is obviously getting better, but we're certainly using a lot more energy. So the job that Dave Bassett took on was update this map. And again, that was something that took a long time. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the details, but I'll give you kind of the higher order findings. You should have a copy of this in your files. And there's actually a CD of all the data sources that were used behind this. If somebody wants to get that, you can let me know, and we'll share that with you. A lot of the growth, the 16 quads, has been in electricity. That's about 11 quads worth of growth. The dominant fuel is petroleum. That's about 40% up here. You've got natural gas and coal, each about 23%. That's nuclear. And here again is our renewables. Up at the top, again, we've graphed what we think the potential is to get out of renewables. This is wind power, a number of different estimates of what we could get from wind. This little arrow coming down is what we're getting from wind right now. Geothermal, a lot of these we couldn't even graph on the paper in terms of potential. It would have expanded beyond the paper. So I think there's a lot of underutilized renewables. That should be, I don't think, any real news. We put some new areas on the map. Right here is the amount of energy we believe we're saving through conservation. They're labeled negawatts, which comes from Amory Lovins. Again, a relatively small arrow. And also we've graphed in something called vampire losses. Vampire losses are the now significant losses from our habit of keeping chargers plugged into our outlets and having millions of devices on standby. And Lawrence Berkeley Lab is now estimating these at 5 to 10% of residential energy use. So we've got some new arrows. I think the thing that's stunning about this is still the incredible inefficiency from a thermodynamic sense. When we generate electricity, we're now throwing away about 28 quadrillion BTUs, which is more than Japan uses to run its entire economy. The waste heat coming off of internal combustion engines as chemicals essentially change it to mechanical energy is about what the Germans use to power their entire economy. So again, you see enormous, I think, thermodynamic inefficiencies in the system. But I think the other thing you can do is sort of see this as an opportunity landscape. It's incredible opportunities in here to go in and grab energy and reduce energy. Anything we do down here, lighting, refrigeration, you get a 1 to 3 leverage in terms of primary energy consumption and any emissions associated with it because of this inefficiency. And we can go out and grab stuff. I'll just give you one example. The hybrid car, it's the Prius. The first thing it does is say, I'm just going to shut the motor off when I'm in a traffic jam. And you'll see a little arrow here on the amount of energy we waste idling and in traffic jams. It's actually pretty significant. So why don't we just use common sense and shut that off? The Prius uses a thermodynamic cycle that was developed in 1882 called the Atkinson Cycle. And that allows the engine to actually make much more efficient use of fuel. It doesn't have a lot of torque for those people who like to go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. But you've got the electric motor there that balances that out. They spent some time on aerodynamic drag. I think that one of the stunning things is we're losing 2.3 quadrillion BTUs pushing cars through the air. And if any of you have looked around the highways, you'll notice probably that the drag coefficient of cars is going up. We don't seem to spend a lot of time on that. The other thing they do is basically when they break the car, change the kinetic energy into electricity. And with that, the combination of technologies, which are now decades to over a century old, you're up to 50 miles a gallon. That's over twice what we've been sort of asking Detroit to do. So I think a lot of what we can do is sort of, let's go back, is not high tech. I mean, it's putting technologies together in rather ingenious ways. One of the things that amazed us when we looked at this map was how do we get in this position? And so after that exercise, we just started graphing money. We just looked at the flow of money. And one of the interesting things we found out is we actually looked at the DOE's R&D budget going back 40 years. And found that only 5% of the R&D had ever been spent on conservation. So almost all of the money that we'd spend up to that point in time was designed to create more supply. And of course we know that it's orders of magnitude cheaper and much faster to conserve a kilowatt hour than to create the supply. I don't think that picture's changed much. It'd be interesting to look at their budget now. The other thing that we said, okay, that's the R&D money. What happens if we track the subsidies? And this is what got us interested in sort of updating this, knowing, and this was a nightmare analysis. It took a long time. And you could just see at that point, 92 was not one of the heydays for renewable energy, if you remember this. But at that point in time, we came up with about 442 million going into renewables and 8 billion going into various kinds of fossil fuels. We did include nuclear in here. We left out the entire transportation sector. We just said that's not even going to be looked at. So that gives you a sense of kind of where things were then. And so when we started working with ELI, we said we're going to update the energy map, which we've done, and then we were going to try to update the subsidies picture. And that's the piece that I want now to turn it over to the ELI folks to share with you, because this was a long and tedious analysis, but I think the results are quite fascinating.
All right. Thank you, Dave. Well, we ELI embarked on trying to just look at what the subsidies for energy were. And as Dave said, certainly was looking into a lot of details. But what I'm going to try and do is give you the picture and try and follow some of Dave's principles about focusing on the big things, the order of magnitude, and not get lost in the decimal points. So the basic results of everything we did, I think, are well summarized in this. So I think we'll spend a little time. You have a copy of it in your packet. Basically, most of the subsidies go to traditional fossil fuels. This quadrant here, and this is proportional in area, if you're looking at things. The other thing is that if you look at sort of the bottom half of this, the vast majority of subsidies are going to fuels that have relatively high emissions of greenhouse gases. So we're also including corn ethanol here. Corn ethanol is renewable, so we've got this split so that we've got renewables on this side. The fossil fuel subsidies are over here. So if you're looking at the total subsidies, and this is over a period of 7 years from 2002 to 2008, the total subsidies are a little over $100 billion. The vast majority of it goes to fuels, energy sources that emit greenhouse gases. The traditional renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, are over here, and as you can see, that's all of those. The total amount has certainly gone up from what Dave talked about in 1992, but it's still considerably smaller than either the subsidies going just to the one source, corn ethanol, or to all of fossil fuels, which is all of this. One of the other things that we think is interesting out of this is that the major route for providing subsidies is through tax incentives, tax breaks. That's the outer ring in each of these. The one place where it doesn't show up as the significant one is with respect to carbon capture and storage. And the majority of subsidy there is direct spending. But overall, with respect to fossil fuels, the major amount of subsidies come from tax expenditures. The same is true with the corn ethanol. And basically they are equal over the 7-year period for renewables. The direct spending and subsidies by tax expenditures are roughly equal over those periods. Now, the other thing as you get into this, and we haven't broken it out specifically, but of the tax expenditures, the largest single item is the preferential treatment of oil and gas income under the foreign tax credit. And this was one that probably took us the longest time to unpack. But when you look at the way the foreign tax credit works, a significant subsidy goes to oil and gas companies as a result of the fact that royalty payments get treated like as a credit rather than as a deduction. And that, over the period that we were looking at, came out to be a little bit more than the total that was attributable to credits for production of non-conventional fuels, which was also the very large amount during the period that we were looking at. As you can, I think, see also in terms of looking at the way the subsidies work, the corn ethanol actually almost equal, the tax breaks for corn ethanol almost equaled the total amount of subsidies for all the other types of renewables. Okay, well, move on. A few other points from what we looked at. The subsidies were generally increasing over most of the period that we were looking at, 2002 to 2007. There was a slight decrease in 2008, primarily attributable to the fact that there was a phase out of the credit for production of non-conventional fuels. In terms of the subsidies, the foreign tax credit is subsidizing production of oil overseas. One of the differences between many of the subsidies for fossil fuels and those for renewables is that the fossil fuels, many of them are permanent provisions of the tax code, and so they were stable, and certainly stable except for the credit for production of non-conventional fuels during our study period, but many of the provisions for providing incentives, particularly tax breaks for renewables, tended to be time limited. They were parts of individual bills and sunsetted in a few years, and so they were variable over the life of our study. I think I've finished with that one. And on the renewables, I think we could see with generally that the tax provisions can be very effective in terms of providing large amounts of subsidies. For renewables, the direct spending actually was larger than the benefit from the tax provisions in 3 out of the 7 years that we were looking at it. The renewables direct spending during the period that we were looking at varied. It did go up and down, but I think if you graphed it out, it looks relatively constant. The tax provisions varied much more considerably during our period. Before I turn it over to Lisa Goldman, I did want to acknowledge the rest of the team that worked on this, because everybody put in an awful lot of work. So in addition to Lisa, our team included Jordan Diamond, Dan Schramm, Jim Barrett, Tommy McCall, Tim Brennan, who's not here, Dave Bassett, and Adenike Adeyeye from ELI. So, Lisa.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to say just a few words about the study methodology, how we defined and quantified subsidies, a little bit about how we arrived at our figures. At the outset, we decided to use a fairly conservative methodology to avoid overstating any subsidy amounts, and we came up with a subsidy definition, which was actions by the U.S. government that provide an identifiable financial benefit associated with the use or production of a fossil or renewable fuel. And our focus really was on deliberate government policies or actions. So there are certainly other things out there that end up benefiting fuel sources financially, but we really limited our analysis to targeted government actions. As far as beneficiaries, we considered beneficiaries that included manufacturers, supply chains, workers, consumers within a particular sector. Now, the study did not try to determine who the particular beneficiaries were, only as part of our definition of what constitutes a subsidy. So again, we weren't looking at the impact of the subsidies. We really were just looking at quantifying them. We used pretty conventional definitions of what constituted a fossil fuel and a renewable energy source. So on the fossil fuel side, we included petroleum and its byproducts, natural gas, and coal products. On the renewable side, wind, solar, hydropower, ethanol, and biomass, and geothermal energy sources. Nuclear energy was not included in this study under the terms of the study. It also doesn't fall under either category. And just to emphasize, we only looked at fuel-specific subsidies, so we didn't look at subsidies available to all industries or to electricity in general, which I'll discuss a little bit later. As far as how did we measure these subsidies, how did we quantify them? We first focused on the cost of subsidy to the government rather than its value to the recipient. Measuring subsidies by their value to the recipient is much more difficult. And again, because we really were focused on deliberate government policies, we wanted to look at what these cost the government. Second, we used absolute numbers to quantify subsidies. We did not look at them through a unit of production analysis. And this is because, again, we're really interested in the cost to government of these deliberate policies. We're not interested in the effects of these subsidies. So this is why we did not break them down per unit of production. As far as our time period, fiscal year 2002 to 2008, we chose this period because we wanted to look at subsidies over a recent, representative, somewhat historic period. We didn't want to look at a present-day snapshot of subsidies. We wanted to include a period of time that would smooth out spikes or any aberrations in a given year. The study period includes all policies that were in effect at any time during that period. Our study also offset qualifying taxes, fees, and other government levies. But we offset these where it was determined that they did not benefit the particular fuel source upon which they were placed. If a government levy or tax ended up benefiting the fuel source that was paying it, we did not offset it from our subsidy figures. Last, we used the most accurate data available. We didn't employ a de minimis cutoff amount, although a lot of our research sources do have de minimis figures, but we used whatever level of accuracy we could get from the data. As a general matter, for our calculations on taxes and foregone revenues generally, we did generally round our amounts to the nearest $1 million. A couple of qualifications, I've thrown a few out there already. Again, our study, we didn't look at how do these subsidies actually affect energy production or consumption. That's a whole other level of analysis, and it's one that we were not prepared to do and did not set out to do. Second, we did not look, again, at whether subsidies benefit consumers or industry. Again, not looking at their effects right now, just looking at what the amounts are. And third, the study does not offer normative judgments about these subsidies. For instance, we count the LIHEAP program, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, as a subsidy to fossil fuels. Counting it as a subsidy is not a statement in any way about the purpose of LIHEAP or whether it's a good policy goal to help low-income households with their heating assistance. So we counted it regardless. And similarly, on the renewable side, we counted subsidies to ethanol production, even though there's considerable debate out there about the climate effects of ethanol. And finally, I'll say a few words about general categories of items that were excluded from our study. The first thing was standards, and these include things like fuel economy requirements or energy procurement standards and the like. We did not count these in the study. They don't provide a direct financial incentive, but they're more like a regulatory requirement. Standards may, in fact, have a financial impact on fuel industries, but they don't constitute a cost to the government. And finally, as a practical matter, there's no federal renewable portfolio standard to consider as well. So we did not look at standards. On a related note, we did not look at regulatory interventions. The study did not examine the impact of regulation or a lack of regulation on energy markets. And one example is the fact that the Clean Air Act currently does not regulate greenhouse gases, which could be considered a benefit to coal and certain other energy sources. But again, it's not a cost to government under our subsidy definition. And as an additional matter, the financial impact of regulations is also difficult to quantify. Third, we did not count non-fuel specific subsidies to electricity transmission, distribution, and generation. So if a subsidy went to electricity generally, and unless it was clear that a portion of the subsidy was aimed at a specific fuel, we did not count it. And one reason is that electricity is indistinguishable by fuel source once it enters the grid. And even though it is possible to prorate electricity by fuel source, our study really, again, focused on government policies aimed at specific fuels. So we did not count subsidies to electricity generally. And of the items that we did count as subsidies, if there were portions of that funding that went to electricity generally, we similarly excluded that. We also didn't count non-specific taxes and other subsidies. So if a tax provision benefited disproportionately energy sources, if it was aimed at all energy sources or all sectors, we did not count it. And this includes certain accelerated depreciation provisions, certain tax debt, and the like. And the idea is these are made equally available to different fuel sources and industries. So again, it's not a deliberate government policy that targets a specific fuel. We also didn't count liability limits in our study, and theoretically these can qualify as subsidies in the sense that they do benefit particular fuels, but it's quite difficult to measure the cost to government in some of these cases. It's true that with a liability limit, the government is the one bearing the risk, but unless an accident occurs that exceeds the liability limit, it's difficult to show that there's been an actual cost to the government. A couple examples of liability limits: the Price-Anderson Act. Again, nuclear fuels were not, or nuclear power was not in our study, so we didn't look at that. And under the Oil Pollution Act, which we discussed earlier in the study, and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act, we decided for various reasons explained in the study not to count those as subsidies. Finally, we did not count energy efficiency and related weatherization efforts. And that's because even though improvements in energy efficiency can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they don't provide a financial benefit to a particular fuel. So again, consistent with our definition of looking at specific deliberate government policies, energy efficiency actually reduces energy use. So we did not consider it, and it's not fuel specific, so we did not consider it to be a subsidy under our definition. And I believe that's it. So we're open for questions.
Okay, well, thank you. We've got, I think, at least a half an hour for questions. And so if you can raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone because we're webcasting this. You could just identify yourself and tell us where you're from, then we can begin. Yeah, Kevin.
Well, the biggest number in the study is obviously the exemption or discounts from the foreign tax credit. And so I'm just curious about what other types of activities are subject to that credit. How similar are they to energy? Is there any rationale for treating oil differently from other economic activities that are taxed under that credit? And is anything else exempted or somehow reduced under that credit?
The foreign tax credit is available to all taxpayers who pay taxes to foreign governments. So the whole idea of the foreign tax credit is to eliminate double taxation. If you're subject to tax on income in another country and subject to tax on the same income in the U.S., then you offset it, you get a credit, so you're not being double taxed. What happens with oil and gas income is that if you went back more than 50 years, there was a initiative by the U.S. State Department to encourage development of foreign oil, and suggested to foreign governments that, you know, there's this credit provision in U.S. tax law, and you can raise funds from oil and gas production in two ways. One, through a general tax on income, and the other, payment of royalties. And royalties are normally treated as a deduction from income and as a business expense in the U.S. So the suggestion was that if you call everything a tax, then you'll get the benefit of the credit, which is worth more under U.S. tax law, and then you can raise your revenue, potentially raise more revenue that way. The provision was then limited in the 1970s, where a limitation on the amount that a company could take as a credit equal to the U.S. tax rate at the time. And so what we did was look at the difference between tax rates in other countries and the U.S. tax rate. During the period of our study, it was consistent. The U.S. tax rate was consistent, which made it a little bit easier. and then the value of the differential between the two that is allowed as a credit under the U.S. system. So the entire policy applies equally to everyone, but there's this differential treatment of oil and gas income, and that's where it comes from.
Yep. Yeah.
I'm Stephen Comstock with the American Petroleum Institute. So I'm interested in the in the analysis. The question I have is with respect to the dual capacity taxpayer provision, which you're talking about. And it's my understanding that that applies to any dual capacity taxpayer. It's not necessarily focused on oil and gas. So isn't it just there's no specific oil and gas provision in the 901-2A regulations. It just applies to any dual capacity taxpayer. And also, don't they have to prove up that it's a tax, but then there's also another provision, the dual capacity taxpayer provision, that they have to prove up if they choose one of the methods that it's not a subsidy in any particular way, or else they don't get any of the credit.
It is true that it applies to dual capacity taxpayers. I think we stand by the reason that it was put in place originally was to benefit oil and gas, and it was specifically put there to benefit oil and gas income. And the way we did it, we focused on income related to oil and gas from the oil-producing countries and separated those out.
I'm sorry. I just want to press this point. If the company has, my understanding is, as long as you can prove that it's a tax, you're able to claim the foreign tax credit under the rules. So any company that goes and proves that the levy that they pay to a foreign government is a tax, an income tax under the U.S. rules, and also if you're a dual capacity taxpayer, whether you be a bank or a construction company or in any type of relationship with a foreign government, then as long as you can prove those two things, that the portion is creditable. It's not associated with just oil and gas taxpayers.
I worked on this today. If I can answer your
Sure.
question. Spent a lot of time getting to that. My name's Jim Barrett. I help work on the study. We spent a lot of time trying to figure this one out. Specifically, what we're talking about was a decision by the State Department in the 1950s to encourage foreign countries to convert their very high royalty payments into income taxes, even though they charge general tax rates that are much lower. Royalty payments are what oil companies pay to foreign entities, or any entity rather, to access the oil in the ground. In many oil-producing countries, the government owns the land, owns the oil, so the payments are made to the government. Typically, in countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, other places like that, they had royalty rates in excess of 50%, sometimes much higher than that. Those could be deducted as a business expense because certain countries wanted to increase their government take from oil activities. They wanted to raise their rates. The State Department said, well, if you convert your royalties to income taxes, you can raise the rates and not cost the oil companies anything because they'll just be able to deduct as an income, as a tax credit against their American income. So it was not the fact that they're dual capacity taxpayers, but it was the conversion of the royalty rates into income taxes in countries where income taxes, corporate income tax rates, were far below those royalty rates that we counted, and we try to account for the differences between the royalty rates and the general income tax rates in every country that we took a look at.
What if I could add a comment? Yeah, my name's Dan Tram. I also worked a lot on this particular provision. Another quick point that I wanted to make about this is that in a lot of these oil-producing countries, oil is not just one of many sectors; it is often the sector. So, although there are generally applicable taxes or the oil company can prove that it's paying what, under the definition of the code, is a tax. In many of these countries, that tax code is applied. The primary source of revenue for that government is that oil company. So the tax code does recognize a distinction, between royalty payments and tax payments. Royalty payments under the tax code, under the dual capacity rules that he's referring to, dual capacity taxpayer rules, are called payments for a specific economic benefit. But there are a lot of very obtuse and confusing twists and turns in the Treasury regulations that I think a nuclear physicist would have a hard time following. But if you look at these things, a lot of there are requirements for what a taxpayer has to prove. But in many cases, it is possible through sophisticated structuring of the tax code on the part of the government and sophisticated work on the part of the company to continue to take advantage of this in a way that we think, again, not making a normative judgment one way or the other, but it is possible to get what should be considered payments for a specific economic benefit, again, which would be deductible under our baseline scenario as a tax credit in the country.
I'm sorry. I appreciate the points, and I also appreciate the history of the issue. I mean, I certainly understand that back in the 50s, many of these companies or countries were moving from pure royalty systems to income tax systems. They were broadening their economic base. They certainly asked what would be good to, how do you want to set up a tax system? They came to companies that came to the United States to look into that situation. I would posit that situation has totally changed in the last 50, 60 years. They don't necessarily need American investment. They have national oil companies to go in. They have other ways. They certainly would like our technology, but they don't necessarily need our capital, the American capital. So I would posit that the tax systems in local countries are now based upon just the fact that they're going to go in and tax you on an income tax. And they also have royalty systems in many of those countries as well. So again, the question is as long as you can prove that it's a tax, and as long as you can prove that what you're paying is not for a specific economic benefit, then how is this in any particular way a non-normative judgment? You're going in and saying that anything over that is a pure royalty, when in fact it is actually a tax not only according to the U.S. but also according to the local country. Are we making a judgment that they can't tax the way they want to, or are we just assuming that they're taxing the way we told them to?
I think maybe we want to finish this, but in fact, they are taxing the way we told them to, and so Saudi Arabia's supposed income tax on oil and gas is, I believe, it was 85%, and the income tax generally applicable to the rest of industry is 20%. What we did was then look at the difference. The Saudi Arabia, the generally applicable income tax is 20%. U.S. is 35%. There's a 15% differential there that we think is fairly attributable to royalties that are being treated as income tax. This is something that we are consistent in our methodology with what the OMB is looking at currently in terms of removing part of that benefit. So the President's budget proposal for 2010 proposed eliminating treatment of this in those countries where there is no generally applicable income tax, and only an income tax applied to oil and gas income. Their estimate over a 10-year period was that this would raise $4.5 billion. Our number comes in at more than that because we looked at all countries whether there was a generally applicable as well and looked at the differential. I think we're quite comfortable with the methodology that we used.
Okay, I'm beginning to feel the way I feel around April 16th when my accountant calls up. Other questions? Yeah.
You should stay down here.
I'm Dick Venata with the Science and Technology Policy Institute, and I want to go back and just get a clarification on the definition. You say that it was applied to funds for the use and production of the energy. Does that include R&D for development?
Yes, we did include those funds.
Because some people could raise questions as to where you start adding on those subsidies and how you apply, what level of S&T funding versus how they apply to a particular industry. And one of the questions is, when you went into the DOE budget and all, well, first of all, did you go into the DOE budget and did you try to extract and relate specific R&D funding or S&T funding to specific sources? Of course, with FE, that's fairly direct, but there's other funding. And the other question I would raise relative to that is the relationship of subsidies to incumbents in an industry versus new players. And tax credits in particular raises this point because often incumbents have income and can take that income tax credit, whereas even if it's a general tax credit, whereas then you have new companies, new entrants who can't take advantage of those tax credits and therefore are eliminated from having those subsidies until they can actually get to funding. How do you look at those two things, or do you look at them as different types of subsidies?
I'll take the first question. We did look at DOE R&D funds. The researcher who did the bulk of that work is sitting 2 people down from you. You're welcome to talk with her afterwards. The appendix of our study explains our methodology, including how we identified and quantified direct expenditures within DOE and also within USDA. And we had a very specific approach looking at the different offices and programs within DOE, and we relied on a couple of different sources to glean information about the different programs and to ascertain what the program objective was and whether or not it constituted a subsidy based on its activities to fossil fuel or renewable energy, and that included R&D. And we explained that in the appendix, and then we relied on a couple of different sources to actually quantify those figures.
And on the subsidy question, certainly tax provisions are more and less available depending on whether you have income. New entrants, it can be very difficult. What we did was identify the provisions in the tax code that potentially provide such benefits, and then looked for the any estimate that we could find of how much money was actually being utilized from that. So there are various OMB, the Joint Tax Committee of Congress will estimate the tax expenditures from these things. We use those wherever they exist, and so there are a number of provisions, particularly for new entrants for renewable, on the renewable side, probably most significant, that the provisions have been available but not necessarily used, and so we include them, we list them, but the amounts may be relatively low because they just weren't used. So what we're looking at is cost to government again, and so it's just how much of that was actually able to be used and was a cost to the government.
Diana?
Hi, this is Diana Baur from EPA. Can you talk a little bit about the history of, say, the top 2 or 3? I mean, we've obviously talked about the foreign tax credit, but the top 2 or 3 contributors on both sides. I mean, it's interesting to sort of see if we're dating back to the 1950s for fossil fuels versus the more intermittent, contributors on the renewable side. I'd just be interested to hear that comparison.
If you look at, on the renewables, the top contributor is the alcohol credit for fuel excise tax, and that's something that has steadily, well, not steadily increased. It increased in the early parts of our study and then somewhat leveled off. There's the credit for renewable electricity production. And then there are some of the depreciation provisions in the tax code that apply to renewables and to oil and gas facilities. The one of the large provisions that benefits fossil fuels is the credit for production of non-conventional fuels, and that actually has sunsetted. So that was quite significant during the period of our study until 2008, when it dropped down to only $100 million for that year. In terms of direct spending, there are many provisions, particularly DOE, with a lot of programs for research and development, and you just have to look at each one of them. None of them are anywhere near the size of the individual tax provisions in terms of their benefit. You want to add anything, Lisa?
Just one thing to note, again, as we were saying, on the fossil side, the larger expenditures really come on the tax side, and on the renewables, it's really the direct spending. On the renewable side, direct spending, we do have a sizable number for corn ethanol funds from USDA. On direct expenditures on the fossil fuel side, again, the LIHEAP program is a sizable amount. We look at the petroleum reserves and the trust funds. That's actually a smaller figure. So,
but can you give a little bit more about the time, the dates when these various things started, or do you know?
That's further down in the detail. Many of them have been around for a long time, and so that we look at the effects, starting in 2002. There are some that come in and began during our period, but I think we'd have to look at real details there. Dan?
We do have this information on file. When I went through the tax code, I went back and found the original public law where the thing was first enacted. Interestingly, some of the biggest fossil fuel ones date back to 1916, and they go back almost 100 years in some cases. So these things have a long history. And of course, I think the point of the study here is to raise the question of whether what was appropriate in the 20th century continues to be appropriate in the 21st century. But we do have that information. If you're interested in seeing it, I can certainly send it to you later.
Questions? Other ones?
Hi, I'm Autumn Hanna from Taxpayers for Common Sense, and I have more of a comment than a question, but it gets to some of the other points that have raised. We've actually looked at energy subsidies for well over a decade at our organization. It is a very complex topic, and there are many lenses that you can look at these subsidies through. And so we are just really happy to see this new study come out and look at this very recent window in time. Getting to some of the historical questions, that's something we've looked at extensively, and we do have information on our website as well on the history, because the fossil fuel industry, the nuclear industry, the coal industry, these are industries that have received decades and decades of subsidies. So I would direct you to that. Thanks.
Other questions? So we're going back. Is there anyone else that we're going back for a second time here? Anyone else that we haven't gotten? Okay. Back for another.
What is your impression as the impact of the ARRA on the relationship of these areas in terms of degrees of subsidies across these different target areas you're talking about?
Well, we didn't look at it specifically, but it's pretty clear that the amounts for renewables will go up, whether it's going to have an actual effect in 2009 or in 2010. Not really sure, but it certainly will significantly increase the amount for renewables. The renewables amount, is a total of $29 billion over the 7-year period, with I forgot something 20 or 16 billion of that, or 17 billion of that going to the corn ethanol. The amount for the traditional renewables is going to increase substantially, but exactly when and how much that is, we did not attempt to try and determine.
Coal also has a big impact.
There is increasing amounts for carbon capture and storage as well. So yeah, that'll change.
Let me go. Here's some. Yeah.
Hello, Ira Dasso with Newest Technologies. What jumps out at me, perhaps more than anything else, is the point that you make that many of the subsidies for fossil fuels, particularly in the tax code, are permanent provisions, whereas the ones for renewables are time limited. Just wondering, did your analysis determine, or could you have determined, would the gap have been any narrower if there had been equal treatment, if there had been permanent on both sides or time limited on both sides? I'm guessing not, but if not, and to my mind the more important question, how might we think about, at least from a legislator's perspective, of leveling the playing field? Should the subsidies for fossil fuels get the permanency removed and become time limited, or alternatively, should the provisions for renewables have that time limitation removed and become permanent?
Well, I think the point is we'd like Congress to reconsider all of this, and this is, I think some of the a part of the puzzle and information that could be useful in looking at them. No, we can't try and speculate as to what it was. We really are looking at how much. What was the government expenditure on any of these things? I mean, one of the things you can note is that the 2005 Energy Act allowed for loan guarantees, but there were in fact no such guarantees that were ever implemented during our period of our study. So through 2008, that was a completely inapplicable provision, though, there in the law. And I think that in terms of things that sunset or may not have been as useful because some of the people that the tax provision may have been intended to benefit, but it wasn't able to benefit them because they had no income to offset with deductions or credits or whatever the benefit was. Those are, in a sense, you're looking at saying that's money sitting on the table that wasn't able to be picked up.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I was in Germany last year. I was driving along, and I stopped next to a farm that had a huge PV array. And I got out, and I asked the farmer, I said, why did you invest in this? And he actually had a spreadsheet. He was very proud to show me. And he said, here's the guaranteed rate that my energy will get sort of bought back at for the next 20 years. And this was the subsidies, and he ran through those for me. But it was exactly that point, that these were set in time, and he could actually run and amortize the entire investment. And I thanked him, and I drove on. But it was quite a stunning revelation, because I came back and was about ready to invest in PV cells for a house I have, and couldn't do it because I didn't know what was going on. I actually pulled a plug on the investment. So that's actually quite an interesting point. I don't know how you actually work it into the calculation, but yeah, Mike?
Hi, it's Michael Brody from EPA, and a couple comments. Although I can't sort of send it out quite yet. I have an analysis of all the non-EPA environmental funding embedded in the Recovery Act, and it's really quite large, and we have it broken down by which agencies have, and it all comes from the individual agency Recovery Act sites. And it's probably over $140 billion, and a lot of it's in efficiency and renewables, advanced battery systems, and things like that. And I'm sure it'll be slow to kick in, but it should kick in sometime. And so that was the main comment. But also, Dave, just listening to that story, and earlier in the month in The Economist and Technology Quarterly, one of the interesting things, they had this articles about electric vehicles, and once they're positing that once you get up to a big enough stock, then the batteries, which are such an expensive part of the car, will no longer be part of the car. So you'll buy it as fuel. You'll be buying miles, and then electric car prices go way down because you don't have to amortize the cost of the battery in the purchase of the vehicle, because you don't amortize the cost of gas when you buy a vehicle. So there's all sorts of things that seem to be being put in place now. So that's all. And when I can share the analysis, I'd be happy to. But it's all freely available on the Recovery Act websites across the government.
And all you have to do is compile it. and we know all about that.
It's called co-op students.
Do you have a compiled version, Michael? In the corner? Yep.
Hi there. My name's David Scher from the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. I think there was a study done a couple of years ago on federal financial interventions in 2007. Are you aware? I assume you're aware of that study. Yeah. Was the methodology used here consistent with that, or if it wasn't, can you point out the main areas where you differed from their point of view on assessing, on quantifying these subsidies? Because it's obviously an area for interpretation.
We're very aware of it. We looked at it. We cover different things in some ways. So I think our methodology, to the extent that we were, to the extent that we could, we're consistent. There are, as we got into the details, we made some different calls because we were focusing possibly more narrowly in some cases, possibly a little broader in other cases.
I don't need to do it in this forum, but it's just obviously one of the things people look at when they compare the landscape is several different studies. Is it possible to be able to try and tie back the main differences thereafter, or is that not something that was tracked during the process?
Well, we didn't specifically track it, but I think that we can, by and large, show. We can certainly show you what, in detail, which items, both in terms of direct spending and in the tax expenditures, which things are included and why. And we have our own list, and we can compare it to that list. We didn't. We weren't doing it by saying, okay, specifically comparing to there, though where there were differences, we were also conscious of it and thinking, what's our rationale here?
Sure.
One example is LIHEAP, I believe, is mentioned in the EIA report, but it's not actually quantified, and those numbers aren't included, and ours are included for LIHEAP, as I mentioned earlier. And one of the consulting economists on our project was one of the reviewers for that EIA 07 report. So we did he did bring a perspective on the EIA methodology as we were formulating our methodology. I don't know if one of our team had an additional response.
Just one quick difference on they did a study by a single year, so sort of the snapshot method, and so for example on their taxes, on their tax estimates, I believe they used OMB numbers. There's actually two government sources for tax expenditure data. One's the OMB and one's the Joint Committee on Taxation in Congress. I think the EIA largely relies on OMB numbers for tax expenditures, and we had a preference for JCT numbers, but when the JCT numbers weren't available, we would use the OMB numbers. This is explained somewhere deep down in the paper. But there are differences in their economic modeling and the types of assumptions that both of those sources make. So, I mean, that's an important distinction to keep in mind. We used some OMB numbers when we couldn't get JCT numbers, but that's really getting into the weeds of things. One of the other things, the EIA study, again, as they noted, there's some things we counted, some things that we counted that they didn't, some things they counted that we didn't. One of the biggest ones that we did that the EIA did not do was provide an estimate of the losses due to royalty relief on federal oil and gas leases offshore. They had a quick snippet about that in their report, saying, there's too many variables here. It's hard to say what's really a subsidy or not, because royalty payments, of course, are dependent on the level of production and the economic attractiveness of that lease in a given time and market prices. So there's some variables involved there. We tried to account for those. We kind of tried to get around that problem by saying we know there's royalty relief on these leases, and we know that's worth a certain amount of money, and we also know that to some extent this has to be offset by the additional amount of investment that oil and gas companies will put into these leases because they're made more attractive by the royalty relief. So there's this slight offsetting problem there, but we tried to adjust for that, and we came up with our own methodology, which I encourage you to look at, sort of going off of something that the Government Accountability Office does when it looks at the royalty relief measures on federal oil and gas leases offshore. And the GAO has done a number of very good reports on those issues. This is just, for distinction, this is slightly different from the royalty in kind issue that's been debated, but that's one thing that's one area where we did something different than what the EIA was doing.
Can I ask one more question? Sure. I was at a hearing the other day where what was being discussed was the repeal of certain oil and gas taxation subsidies for the 2010 budget, and the witnesses put forward wildly different numbers for the impact on the industry. Is it possible to isolate in your analysis what your view of the contribution of those measures over the past 6 years has been to that industry?
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand the question exactly, but
maybe I'll just rephrase. I apologize if I explained it badly. There were 4 or 5 or 6 main subsidies that there was talk of repeal. Is it possible to isolate exactly how those have been quantified in the period you've looked at?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
To break, is it possible to see that analysis?
Well, for our tax numbers.
Overview?
One of the original ideas behind the study was we could do this because we were just going to do a lit review and just go and look at what was out there, and that proved to be very difficult because of the different assumptions that are used in all the different studies, which we were just talking about with respect to the EIA. But with the tax stuff, the JCT and the OMB put these numbers out, and they break it down by provision, and so there's a specific section of these tax expenditure reports that deals with energy-specific type subsidies, and these are published each year. Unfortunately, they don't do a great job of giving you really accurate numbers historically because they're based on they're generally projections forward into the future. So the JCT annual tax expenditure report will give you 5 years of projections of what this tax expenditure is going to do, assuming that the law does not change over that time period. What we did in our method here with these tax provisions is for each one we went, for each year we went to the year closest in time to that forward estimate and took that number. So theoretically this should give us the most accurate picture of how that the level of fiscal impact of that particular provision, tied to a particular fuel source over our time period. We do have those numbers And again, I think that's something that we could share with you if you were interested in seeing how each of these specific provisions has the level of fiscal impact over our time period.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah. Well, last question then.
Okay, I didn't introduce myself before. Kevin Finner, and I'm with magazine Issues in Science and Technology at the National Academy of Sciences. I know that you deliberately did not talk about effects, try to look at what this meant for prices and so on. But just as a factual matter, how much money was spent on energy during this period, so we know, in general scale, how large the subsidies are as a part of the general energy market. And then a somewhat related question. At the Academy of Sciences, we naturally think of research as different from everything else everybody else does, and that a subsidy for R&D is different from a subsidy in immediate terms, tax relief, and so on. Is there a rationale for putting R&D and other types of more immediate short-term subsidies in the same pot and making comparisons?
First of all, we have no idea how much money has been spent on energy.
Yeah. Dave, do you know?
It depends on which year you're looking at, because we've seen some pretty wicked escalations in prices. But it's in the order of 500 to 600 billion per year. And you can take.
Did people hear that? It's 5 to 600 billion per year for energy.
Piece of that's going outside the country.
But I mean, the point was that we were not interested in that. We were looking at the cost to government of subsidies, and so also consistent with that, we did our best to find all of the subsidies and list them, count them. R&D is it is one of the ones that's tends to have been there as new areas for R&D come up. There may be new programs added. It's certainly a subsidy when we identify them as applying to specific fuels. Again, there are many that we looked at and said, well, we're not including them because either they are aimed at energy efficiency or electricity generally, or some other things like that.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I'd like to thank, obviously, Jay and Lisa, and also some of the people here that spent untold hours, probably in weeks, grinding through the data. We have got a lot of data, and we'll certainly be glad to share that with anybody that wants to look at the assumptions or the data that was flowing into these analysis. So, and the stuff will go on the website, right, if people are interested?
I haven't checked our website this morning, but it is there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.